Jack Ridley had always dreamed of space, not in the grandiose save-the-galaxy kind of way, more in the quiet, hopeful way that some kids dream about distant mountains or deep oceans. He'd grown up on the Kansas plains, where the night sky stretched endlessly and the stars felt closer than the neighbors. His family ran a modest grain farm, and Jack's life revolved around work, long days, tough hands, and the constant rhythm of planting and harvesting. When he wasn't working, he spent hours poring over old sci-fi vids and magazines, imagining what it might be like to see those stars up close. But dreaming about space and actually stepping into it were two very different things. Now, standing on the alloy deck of the landing bay at Outpost Kronos, Jack wasn't sure he'd made the right decision. This was the farthest he'd ever been. From home, beyond Earth's atmosphere, beyond the solar system, beyond anything he'd ever imagined. The air smelled strange, heavy with a metallic tang. The station was massive, a sprawling labyrinth of hangars, barracks and training grounds suspended on the fringe of the Orion Arm. Every surface gleamed in polished steel and alien alloys, illuminated by the cold, bluish light of overhead panels. Jack had just stepped off the transport pod, still clutching his duffel, when he noticed them. His fellow recruits. They weren't human. That much he'd expected, though the reality of it hit harder than he'd anticipated. Some were massive, towering twice his height, with scaled, segmented limbs that clicked against the deck. Others were more amorphous, their translucent bodies shimmering and shifting like liquid glass. One or two were vaguely humanoid, but their glowing eyes and strange, pulsating skin made them look more like walking nebulae than people. As Jack hesitated, unsure where to go next, a group of alien soldiers sauntered toward him. They were clad in military-grade armor that shimmered faintly in the artificial light. Their helmets were off, exposing a variety of features: razor-sharp teeth, bioluminescent patches, mandibles that clicked and clacked. The tallest among them, a green-scaled creature with a muscular frame and a wide, toothy grin, stopped a few feet away. "Well, what have we here?" Its voice boomed, the words processed through a universal translator implant that gave them a faintly mechanical edge. It crossed its arms, towering over Jack by a good 3 feet. "A new recruit! I didn't think they'd actually send another human." Jack's shoulders stiffened. He knew humans were rare in the Galactic Armed Forces. The official reason was Earth's late entry into the Alliance, but everyone knew the real reason. Humans weren't exactly the strongest, fastest, or toughest species in the galaxy. The scaled alien leaned down, its teeth glinting in the cold light. "Hey, Earth boy," it drawled, "sure you're in the right place? Maybe you're looking for the supply depot, where the cooks hang out." Laughter erupted from the other recruits, a cacophony of deep, resonant chuckles, high-pitched glicks, and warbling chirps. Jack felt his face heat up. His instincts told him to shrink back, to avoid the confrontation. But something else, a stubborn streak as deep as the plains he'd come from, kept him rooted in place. "I'm right. Where I'm supposed to be," Jack said evenly. He looked up at the alien, meeting its glowing eyes. That earned him a few raised brows. At least he thought that's what the alien's shifting expressions meant. The green-scaled soldier tilted its head, clearly amused. "We'll see about that," it said, stepping back to join the others. They moved on, their laughter fading as they walked toward one of the larger training halls. Jack stood there for a moment, gripping the strap of his duffel, before finally making his way toward the barracks. The halls of Outpost Kronos were vast and disorienting. Everything seemed built on a scale, designed to make humans feel small. Doors were taller, ceilings higher, corridors wider than anything back home. Even the other recruits, moving in groups or slithering down the halls, seemed more at ease. Jack felt like an awkward outsider. When he reached his assigned bunk, he found it was sandwiched between two alien recruits who barely acknowledged him. The one on the left was a long-limbed creature with a spiked exoskeleton that emitted a faint, rhythmic clicking sound. The one on the right was a three-eyed being from a methane-breathing world, its bluish skin covered in a faint sheen of frost. Jack kept his head down, unpacked his things, and lay back on the stiff mattress, staring up at the ceiling. He'd known this wasn't going to be easy, but as he closed his eyes, the doubts crept in. What if they were right? What if he didn't belong here? What if he really was just an Earth boy out of his depth? Still, the memory of the Kansas sky filled his mind. The vastness, the challenge, the promise of something more. Jack took a deep breath, clenched his fists, and made a silent vow. He might be a long way from home, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. Not yet. Jack's first morning at Outpost Kronos started early. A grating alarm tone echoed through the barracks, sending the alien recruits shuffling to their feet with practiced efficiency. Jack groaned, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and stumbled into his uniform. The fabric felt strange against his skin, lightweight but firm, designed for a wide array of environmental conditions. He barely had time to adjust it before a booming voice blared through the barracks speakers. All recruits report to the training grounds immediately. The training grounds were massive. Rows of equipment lined the perimeter. Racks of shimmering plasma rifles, towering stacks of weight blocks, and obstacle courses that looked like they'd been built for creatures twice his size. A dense crowd of recruits had already gathered, their various forms casting odd, shifting shadows under the cold, artificial light. Some were stretching or warming up in ways Jack couldn't even fathom, an amorphous alien to his left simply absorbed a nearby nutrient gel pack and pulsed brighter, while a four-legged insectoid creature to his right clicked its mandibles and shifted its carapace with metallic scrapes. Then the instructors arrived. A small group of them, battle-hardened veterans with scarred exoskeletons, glowing cybernetic eyes, and battle insignias etched into their armor, stepped forward. The lead instructor, a towering reptilian alien with a jagged scar running across his snout, stepped onto a raised platform. "Welcome to the gauntlet," he growled, his voice harsh and guttural. The universal translator made it understandable, but it didn't soften the edges. "Here, you will be tested. Some of you will succeed. Many of you will fail. And failure here is not a dishonor. It is a reminder of what you must overcome. For those of you who do pass, remember, this is only the beginning." Jack swallowed hard. He didn't miss the way the instructor's glowing eyes swept over him, lingering for a split second before moving on. He felt small, and not just in stature. The instructor barked out the first challenge, the obstacle course. Jack watched as recruits broke into groups and began tackling the course, scaling massive vertical walls, weaving through jagged barriers, and leaping over spinning platforms that emitted bursts of energy. The alien recruits were fast, agile, and resilient. They moved with a precision that left Jack in awe. He even saw one of them, a sinuous creature with flexible, segmented limbs, vault clear over a 20-foot barrier without breaking stride. Jack's turn came, and he charged forward, determined to give it his all. The first wall was a disaster. He barely managed to grab the top edge, and his boots slipped against the smooth surface. Gritting his teeth, he hoisted himself up, arms trembling with effort. His landing on the other side was awkward, his knees buckling slightly as he hit the ground, but he kept moving. The barriers shredded his uniform at the knees and elbows, and by the time he reached the energy platforms, he was gasping for breath. One of the spinning platforms sent a burst of energy toward him, and he had to dive awkwardly to avoid it. He hit the ground hard, rolled, and scrambled back to his feet. All around him, alien recruits were zipping past, their forms blurring with speed and precision. Jack kept going, fueled more by stubbornness than any sense of skill. By the time he crossed the finish line, his limbs felt like lead. He glanced back and saw that he was one of the last to finish. The other recruits had already gathered by the weight blocks, a series of shimmering alloy cubes that emitted a faint, vibrating hum. Jack stumbled into line as the instructors began, assigning recruits to lift progressively heavier weights. The blocks themselves were infused with graviton fields, their density far greater than their size suggested. The alien recruits stepped up one by one, gripping the blocks and heaving them off the ground with relative ease. The largest among them, like the green-scaled brute who'd mocked Jack the day before, handled the heaviest weights as if they were little more than sandbags. Jack was near the end of the line. When his turn came, he approached a medium-weight block and knelt down, gripping its edges. The metal hummed under his hands. He pulled. Nothing. He pulled again, teeth gritted, and it finally shifted. With a groan, he managed to get it off the ground for a few seconds before it dropped back down. His arms screamed in protest, his hands ached. The alien recruits around him exchanged looks, some with pity, others with barely disguised amusement. The green-scaled brute let out a low, rumbling laugh. "Don't hurt yourself, Earthboy," it said. Jack didn't look up. He knew the aliens were laughing at him, that he was proving their low expectations right, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him quit. Instead, he returned to the line and watched silently as the others continued the exercise, some of them shifting to even heavier blocks. By the time the instructors called an end to the session, Jack felt utterly drained. Back in the barracks that evening, Jack's bunkmate, a methane-breathing alien with 3 eyes and frosted blue skin, shook its head. "I don't understand why they even let your species in," it said bluntly. "No offense, but you don't have the biology for this. You can't lift the weights. You're too slow. You're just not built for it." Jack didn't respond. He lay on his bunk, staring. At the ceiling, his muscles throbbed, his pride stung. The alien was right about one thing. He wasn't built like the others. But as he thought back to the grueling day, a memory surfaced. It was from years ago, back home on the farm. He'd been a scrawny teenager then, tasked with hauling sacks of grain that weighed more than he did. His father had told him the same thing over and over. Strength isn't just in your muscles, Jack. It's in your mind. It's in knowing what you're made of, even when others don't see it. That memory stuck with him. As Jack closed his eyes that night, his exhaustion was outweighed by something else, a quiet determination. He might not be the strongest or the fastest, but he was still standing, and that meant he still had a chance. By the time the training cycle entered its second week, Jack had come to terms with the relentless grind. Each morning began with the same alarm call, the same stiff uniform, the same walk to the training grounds under the alien recruits' wary glances. Jack was still at the bottom of the pack. His times on the obstacle course were unimpressive, his endurance in combat drills barely passable. He kept to himself, focused on completing every task, even when it left him breathless and aching. The aliens still whispered and chuckled when he lagged behind. The green-scaled brute, who Jack had come to know as Vraxa, continued to needle him at every turn. "Better keep that uniform clean, Earth boy. That way, when they send you home, you'll look nice and proper for the civilian job you'll need." The others laughed. Jack let it slide off his back, but then the instructors brought out the weapon. It was the end of a grueling session on strategic positioning, and the recruits were restless. One of the instructors, a reptilian alien with cybernetic arms, called them to attention in the middle of the training yard. "Today," it barked, "we test your strength and coordination. Behold the T-67 plasma cannon." The weapon was immense. Its 6-barreled assembly shimmered with refracted light, and a dull, vibrating hum seemed to radiate from its core. It rested on a specialized rack at the center of the yard, dwarfing even the largest recruits. The cannon's surface was covered in conduits and power nodes that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The instructor stepped aside, gesturing toward the weapon. "This," it continued, "is the primary artillery used to breach starship hulls and fortified installations. It takes a team of 3 to lift it onto the firing platform. Anyone who believes they have the strength to handle it alone may step forward." the recruits muttered among themselves. Jack could see the glances they exchanged, the quick calculations in their eyes. Most of them were sizing up their competitors, trying to determine who might be strong enough or foolish enough to attempt it. Vraxor was the first to step forward. The green-scaled giant smirked as he approached the weapon, cracking his knuckles loudly enough to be heard across the yard. "This'll be easy," he said, shooting Jack a pointed glance. With a low growl of effort, Vraxor gripped the cannons. Sides and heaved. The cannon moved, but only just. It lifted off its rack by a few inches before Vraxor's muscles trembled and he was forced to set it back down. Still, he stood tall, flexing his arms as though the attempt alone had proved his worth. A few others tried after him. A hulking quadrupedal creature, an insectoid with razor-like forearms, and a translucent being whose amorphous body flowed around the weapon's edges. They all managed to lift it a little, but none could sustain the weight. The cannon remained in place, its faint hum a quiet challenge to all who approached it. Jack hesitated. He didn't look the part. He knew it. He wasn't tall and muscular like Vraxor. He didn't have the alien physiology that allowed his peers to endure higher gravities or channel extra strength through their exoskeletal structures. But Jack wasn't thinking about that. Instead, his mind wandered back to the farm, the long, hot summers, the dusty air, and the never-ending tasks that had tested his resolve. He remembered the weight of the grain sacks, heavier than he thought. He could handle, and the look of quiet approval in his father's eyes when he managed to load them onto the truck without help. "Anyone else?" the instructor prompted, its mechanical arms folding across its chest. Jack stepped forward. The murmurs started immediately. The aliens in the crowd exchanged incredulous looks, and someone muttered, "What's he doing? He'll snap himself in half." Vraxor barked out a harsh laugh. "Oh, this I have to see." Jack ignored them. He approached the cannon, his boots scuffing the ground. The weapon's hum grew louder as he placed his hands on it, feeling the cold alloy against his palms. It was heavy, unbelievably heavy. He didn't have an exoskeleton to support his back, or any cybernetic enhancements to boost his strength. All he had was himself. Jack took a deep breath, centered himself, and began to lift. At first it felt impossible. His muscles burned, his shoulders screamed in protest, and his legs wobbled as the cannon inched upward. But he kept going. His grip was firm, his breathing steady. The memory of those grueling farm tasks, the endless repetitions of hauling and lifting, flashed through his mind. They'd shaped him in ways that weren't obvious, even to him. He didn't need to be the strongest. He just needed to be steady. Slowly, almost agonizingly, the cannon rose higher. Jack's knees locked, his back straightened, and the weapon lifted fully off its rack. The murmurs stopped, the laughter died away. A stunned silence fell over the training yard. Jack gritted his teeth, held the cannon aloft for a moment longer, then carefully lowered it back down. His arms trembled as he released his grip, but he kept his composure, turning to face the group. The instructor's glowing eyes fixed on him. It gave a slow nod. "Not bad, human," it said. Vraxor's smirk had vanished. The other recruits stared at Jack, their alien features showing something new, respect. Jack didn't wait for any comments. He simply returned to his spot in the line, breathing hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. He wasn't sure what had just changed, but he knew it was something significant. The training would still be hard, the obstacles still daunting. But for the first time, Jack didn't feel like the underdog. He felt like he belonged. The day after Jack lifted the T-67 plasma cannon, a subtle shift rippled through Outpost Kronos. In the crowded mess hall, where the air buzzed with clicks, hisses, and guttural alien chatter, Jack noticed fewer sneers and more curious glances. The table where Vraxor and his group usually sat, always loud, always mocking, grew quieter when Jack walked by. They weren't exactly friendly, but there was no more open ridicule. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the week wore on, Jack realized that his standing among the recruits was changing. The crystalline alien who had once dismissed him as house pet material now asked him to partner up during team drills. The methane-breathing recruit in the next bunk, who told him outright that he didn't belong, started sharing tips about how to conserve energy during endurance runs. Jack wasn't one of the top recruits, not by a long shot, but he wasn't invisible anymore. He was becoming something unexpected, a respected part of the team. It wasn't just that one feat of strength that had changed their minds. It was the way Jack carried himself afterward. While some recruits might have milked their victory for attention or tried to hold it over the others, Jack stayed humble. He still showed up early to training, still helped others when they struggled, still put in the work. The recruits noticed. Even Vraxa seemed to acknowledge it in his own gruff way. One evening, after a particularly grueling tactical simulation, Vraxa approached him in the barracks. The green-scaled giant leaned against the bunk frame and crossed his massive arms, studying Jack with his glowing yellow eyes. For a moment, Jack wondered if Vraxa was going to lob another insult at him. But instead he said, "That was a clean move you pulled today in the field. Smart, efficient." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Thanks," he replied, his tone cautious. "You've got grit, Earth boy." Vraxa continued, his voice low. "Not something I see often. Guess I was wrong about you." He extended a clawed hand. Jack hesitated only a moment before gripping Vraxa's hand. The alien's grip was crushing, but Jack held firm, meeting his gaze. When Vraxa released him and walked off, Jack sat back on his bunk, still processing what had just happened. The next day, during another obstacle course drill, Jack found himself flanked by recruits who had once ignored him. They didn't carry him, didn't lower the bar for him, but they worked alongside him. They watched each other's backs, pointed out better routes, and offered small gestures of encouragement. Jack didn't ask for it, but he didn't refuse it either. He gave back as much as he got, offering his own observations and suggestions, drawing on the tactics he'd picked up from a lifetime of figuring out how to make do with what he had. Over time, the instructors started to notice the change as well. The lead trainer, the reptilian alien with cybernetic arms, began calling on Jack more often during tactical briefings. Jack wasn't the strongest or fastest, but he had proven that he could think under pressure. His ideas, once dismissed out of hand, were now weighed carefully. Sometimes the instructors even nodded in agreement, though they rarely offered direct praise. Their approval came in subtle gestures, longer moments of eye contact, a slower nod, a slightly less gruff bark of instruction. By the end of the training cycle, Jack had found his place. He wasn't just the human recruit anymore. He was a part of the team, a soldier who had earned his spot through persistence, humility, and quiet determination. The aliens no longer saw him as an outsider. They saw him as one of their own. When the final evaluations were posted, Jack's name wasn't at the top. He hadn't suddenly transformed into the strongest or the fastest recruit, but he was listed as one of the most reliable. The instructor's notes praised his adaptability, his ability to remain calm under pressure, and his growing tactical acumen. For Jack, that was more than enough. On the last day of training, as the recruits prepared to move on to their next assignments, Vraxa approached him again. This time there were no smirks, no half-hidden barbs. "You're all right, Ridley," he said simply, using Jack's name for the first time. "Wouldn't mind having you on my team out there. You ever need backup, you know where to find me." Jack nodded, his chest swelling with a quiet pride. "Thanks, Vraxa. Same goes for you." As the transport pods arrived to carry them to their new units, Jack looked back at the training grounds one last time. He thought about the long days, the grueling exercises, the doubts that had gnawed at him. He thought about the farm back, On Earth, the endless fields and the weight of grain sacks that had seemed so unbearable as a boy. He thought about the stars he had dreamed of as a kid and realized that now, here on the edge of the galaxy, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Jack climbed into the transport pod, settled into his seat, and let out a deep breath. He wasn't sure what challenges lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: he belonged.